really, this is a new class of material. These are new biomaterials, and this allows you to do both storytelling from a business perspective, but also, again, from a mission perspective, being able to communicate a vision of the future that is open in that way.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
Good, Erum. What's going on?
Just been busy making some changes. Spring is in the air. I don't know if you know, but there was a scientific process in February where the state of Pennsylvania has this groundhog that predicts the weather, and it predicts that it's going to be spring sooner. So like 6 more weeks of spring. And I'm starting to feel it. So it's very accurate.
Yeah, so I hope that is true. I was briefly in California where it was much warmer. And then when I flew back and got off the airplane, I was like, oh my God, it is so cold, because it was like 20 degrees when I got back here. So I welcome spring, and I'm happy for spring to be starting. So here we are. This is the Grow Everything podcast, where we talk about how people are changing the world by growing everything. What do you have on your list of quick intros that we should talk about before we get into today's episode?
I wanted to say that our last episode was amazing with Edward Senderovich of Synonym. And just what they're doing is incredible. They gave us a shout out on LinkedIn. So thank you very much for that. And the idea of creating this infrastructure for biomanufacturing and using the analogy of AWS or Amazon Web Services that really powers the internet that we all consume every day. Last time I checked, it was like 40% of the internet was AWS. I'm sure that Azure, Microsoft's product, is gaining momentum in terms of internet infrastructure, hosting databases and processing and things like that. So that analogy that Edward used is very strong. I thought it was great. I know that you've met him and talked to him about biomanufacturing. What did you think about that episode?
The episode is great. Edward brought up a lot of good points. We've said that biomanufacturing is one of our themes for the year. And when I saw Edward at Biofabricate earlier in the year, he was on stage with a guy from Boston Consulting Group, and Boston Consulting Group released a report earlier in the month. But then today, as we're recording this, they just released a second longer report called Breaking the Cost Barrier on Biomanufacturing. And we'll make sure we include that in the show notes, because it kind of shows what's happening in the space of biomanufacturing and how bigger companies can meet their sustainability goals by transforming their supply chains with bioproducts. So I think that that's a super compelling way of describing what Edward and his team are doing. And I know we've got another podcast coming up with Tara Shirvani, who's also looking at biomanufacturing as an asset class. And so we'll dig further into that when we talk to her in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
You have also a note in our show notes about India's bioeconomy, which you've been paying a lot of attention to. What's going on with India right now?
Now that I know more people that are working on developing the India bioeconomy when it comes to founders and investors, and our friends at Anchor Capital, which is a fund in India, released their deep tech report. And I spoke to them a little bit about it, and it's very interesting how they're framing their investment thesis. In general, India has invested a lot in AI and biotechnology, so that leads the funding and the capital allocation in India. But they really called out advanced materials as an emerging sector to invest in. They mentioned that 80% of total investments since 2010 has been going to AI and biotech, and that advanced materials is gaining momentum. But I like how they also framed, and I have to read more into this deep tech report, and I'll share this in the show notes. But I like how they frame it, where they talk about today's deep tech, it's tomorrow's mainstream tech. So helping people think like, yes, you're working on this, it's very advanced, but think about a future where it's commonplace, and how do you pull that forward into the now? I think that's very powerful thinking, because usually just thinking of one little problem as it relates to the way that today works, but tomorrow is a different world. And so how do you do that thought exercise to think about, all right, all these other things will be happening in the future. How can we pull that to the now? The big thing too, I really appreciated their technology readiness level framework, where they look at how companies in the tech space can look at how ready their technology is from a science perspective. So like, what are the risks associated with the science? And then looking at getting funding through grants in the early stage, and then progressing their fundraising to seed and what seed should look like. You should have prototypes at that stage. You should have early pilots, looking at the engineering risks at that time. And it goes into Series A and then Series B. And it has this really great framework on how to measure your technology readiness and how to be positioned in order to gain that funding. So definitely something worth looking at for any founders, anybody that's working at a company that's in the early stages. I would, again, take a look at that deep tech report in the show notes.
Yeah, I know we're going to talk about advanced materials because our interview is around materials, but I just wanted to make a mention of what I find interesting about that report is this idea that 80% of total investment in India since 2010 has been in AI and biotech. I'd like to know what percentage goes to each one of those. Maybe that's in the report. I ended up listening to another podcast over the weekend from A16Z where they were talking about the development of ChatGPT's Zora, which is their video generation engine, which is very, very impressive. What was interesting about that episode was, number one, the interview was with a Stanford professor. He's been working in generative AI for over a decade, and he was actually surprised as to how good Zora is. It was kind of a deep episode. There was a lot of vocabulary and things that I was just like, that's gone over my head. I don't know what a transformer is. I don't know what these different flavors of AI are or the technologies that are behind them. So it's a whole other world. I'll stick to biology for now. And we should have someone on here to talk about that intersection between AI and biotech because there is a lot happening in that space. But the other thing that came out of that news that really caught my eye, Tyler Perry, the movie director in Atlanta, had raised money, $800 million, to build a movie studio in Atlanta. Tyler Perry is known for his Medea, if I'm saying it the right way, series of movies, very successful director. Apparently, once he saw Zora, he's like, you know what? A lot of people are going to lose their jobs, so we're not going to take all this funding. We're going to re-examine whether we need it because this is so good, it's really going to change the way films are made. And I think there's some truth to that. The other news that I think is worth mentioning, which is relevant to a post that you recently wrote on LinkedIn, Erum, you wrote a post about 23andMe and people owning their own genomic data. The Biden administration is now looking to make sure that any genomic data that is collected in the United States stays in the United States. They don't want to allow our genomic data to be floating around the internet to other countries or having other countries collect that data, which I find to be super interesting. And they also had maybe the same picture you had of 23andMe's headquarters. But that's for another time.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about materials.
Yeah, I do want to make a comment about Tyler Perry's re-examining the investment because of the Sora tool that's come out, which I've seen some of the Sora videos. People shared links with me from X. There is a little bit of creepy vibe that these people aren't real, but they look real. So when they smile, you're like, that's like a machine smiling. So it looks creepy in that regard. But if you don't know, maybe it's not that creepy. But aside from that, and I have to reiterate this too, because kind of the big thing with these technology tools that leverage machine learning and how they can replace jobs or make them more efficient. It's this whole concept that Scott Galloway has been talking about recently called corporate Ozempic.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, where companies are just downsizing their employee base because they're just becoming more efficient. And it's just very interesting to see how there's been a reaction like, oh no, these people are losing their jobs, how blah, blah, blah. And like, which is a big thing. It's a big deal. But at the same time, when you're working at a technology company, the writing is on the wall from day one because technology is designed to be more efficient and working on something to essentially make that role not obsolete, but streamlined. So yeah, you have 10 people working on a certain project, but then you're using tools and technology to automate it as much as possible that you go from 10 to 1 or 2. So it should not come as a surprise that tech companies are downsizing is the name of the game. There's ethical issues around that, of course. I don't want to say that there isn't, but it also is how do we make this a bit more equitable is one thing, but standardized because that is the way these companies in our world works right now, at least in the Western world. It's capitalism. We're just growing. There's someone that we might have on the podcast, Tukufu Zuberi, who is a professor at University of Pennsylvania, who has a very interesting take on capitalism and its role in society. But anyway, aside from that, I think it's just very interesting. It's very topical to talk about how AI is influencing society and the employee base that we have here.
Yeah, we're only at the beginning of it. Edward on our last podcast said we still haven't had the chat GPT moment for biomanufacturing. And it's true. We are living through the beginning of really AI revolution. I mean, we use it. We know a lot of people who are using it. We can tell when people are using it. And it's just going to become a ubiquitous tool. But let's switch gears since today's interview is about materials, biomaterials, and transforming the way in a different way.
So today's interview is with Ross McBee, co-founder and CSO, so Chief Science Officer of TomTex, a materials company based in Brooklyn, New York, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is the coolest place to start a company in, I'd argue, the world. And we know Ross through his co-founder CEO, Yuan Tran, who we had met. Karl, you've known her a little bit longer than me. Actually, how did you meet Yuan?
I think we met her through Indie Bio. She was probably one of the people who presented at Indie Bio, and we got to know each other through the Indie Bio program, where we're friendly, we've been mentors, and Uyen is a very interesting person. But the company that Uyen and Ross founded, TomTex, is developing a biomaterial using shrimp waste, basically the chitin shells that cover these insects of the sea. And there is a lot of this waste readily available all over the world. This is a very circular, very interesting process. We've touched the material. We've seen how it's evolving. It's a beautiful material. It's not like any other biomaterial. I mean, we've seen the polybion material. We've seen the mycelium materials from Milo and other companies. But the TomTex material has its own characteristics. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with Ross and also to talk more about the material and what they're doing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Here comes the interview. Ross McBee, we're so happy to have you on the Grow Everything podcast. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to have you on the podcast since we first met, which was last year sometime. You gave us a tour of your laboratory and we saw some of the materials that you guys are whipping up. And then we met again at the TomTex holiday / investment closing party, which was super fun. It was super fun. And we had a great conversation about everything. And I was like, oh my gosh, why didn't we record our conversation? Because it was perfect podcast material. So now here we are on the podcast.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. That party was nice. It was a good wrap up to a good year, I think.
Awesome. Yeah. And then we ran into each other at Biofabricate in Paris. How was that for you?
That was cool. I mean, it was great to be in Paris. It's a new venue. You get to see some people, get to meet some people that might not have made it out to the States, which is cool. It's always great to see the progress of everyone. You always keep your eyes open, but having everyone together and being able to talk and being able to get people to talk maybe a little bit more openly than they would in other contexts is also great too. I really think, and I think a lot of other people feel this way, that this is not a winner-take-all space. Rising tide lifts everyone. So sharing, being open, being able to talk freely and strategize and talk about how we could work together on things is also a really great sort of opportunity for an event like that. That was a pretty productive few days.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's great to hear. We'll definitely have to dig into that more. I love the rising tide, and there's very interesting biomaterial companies that are out there. And when we make products, it's not necessarily one material, it's multiple. So that makes a lot of sense that you guys can collaborate and get those connections. But why don't we just kick it off from the beginning? I mean, what led you to co-found TomTex? Like, what was the inspiration behind creating bio-based materials?
Yeah. So a lot of my background is in biology. A lot of my formal training is in synthetic biology. There's a bit of my brain that has always been really engineer-brained as well. For a long time, I thought I'd be an engineer until I realized I'm pretty bad at math. And so I think this space really feels like a really interesting crossover of those Venn diagrams. You're trying to learn as much from nature as you can, but you're applying that to a product. This is about making something that actually goes out into the world and that people can touch and use and live with. And that's fundamentally the appeal to me, kind of at the surface level, is being able to take what we hope is a pretty sophisticated approach and apply that in a way that actually touches people's lives. There's a strategic element to this particular choice as well, in the sense that while you could probably make a pretty coherent case that something like packaging is a more impactful space to be operating in, fashion is interesting because it really touches people's hearts. I personally really think that the climate crisis is not just a techno-economic crisis. It's probably a cultural one as well. It's about the way that we relate to the world as much as it is about how the spreadsheet works. And so if you're thinking about the problem in that lens, then you should probably be working in a space that has some sort of cultural valence. And fashion is a great example of that. People really care about how they dress. They really see this as a reflection of their identities, of their lives. So being able to say, hey, look, this isn't a worse alternative to something you like. This is a new way of thinking about what the future could look like in terms of real, tangible materials, the stuff the world is made of. I think this space has a really interesting resonance there. Part of the other appeal for me is coming from an academic background where you can be a little, I won't say siloed, but you can get very focused in a way that at its worst can end up feeling like you're really not having much of an impact. And experience like this, you really feel like you're putting something out into the world quickly, efficiently, with power and purpose. That can be pretty gratifying too. So that's maybe the personal kind of attraction to it. From a technical perspective, I did a bunch of my PhD work here in New York at Columbia. And then on the side, I've done some consulting work, basically with artists and designers. Some people that want to use bacteria or fungus as part of their practice, but also just some more straight up engineering, mechatronics, sculpture design stuff. So it was sort of at the edge of the biodesign space. Then connected with Atom, who had started the company a little bit earlier. Technically, I'm a late co-founder and was working with them and really got along well. So joined up to lead the development side of things. And very happy I did. It's been an immensely gratifying experience and an immensely interesting experience to work on this project for the last few years.
That's fantastic. You talked about being in academia and maybe not having an impact or feeling like you're super siloed. And then you also talked about the impact of fashion on people, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how do traditional textiles that are in the fashion industry, how do they impact the environment? And how does the materials that TomTex is developing compare to that?
Sure. Yeah. Off the top of my head, you could probably chunk this into 3 categories. The first is the pure input material category. So a huge fraction of modern textiles are not natural materials. They're synthetic materials. They're petrochemical plastics, fundamentally. Depending on how you count, these are probably the majority by mass of textile materials that get used. There's obvious problems with this. From my perspective, if you are thinking about what the world needs to look like in 2100, solving atmospheric carbon is not enough. There's a real nightmare scenario where everyone gets their shit together, pardon my language, and solves for atmospheric carbon. Then the planet drowns in plastic because there's a huge oversupply of petro supply. We haven't really broken the fundamental issue, which is that we need to build things in a more regenerative way, in a more cyclical way. That's a very basic ground truth you can start with. If you're looking at fashion, the amount of impact, both from an emissions perspective, but also from this material reality perspective, is very high. The second class of impact is the production itself. There's some significant concerns about land use and water use and the use of a variety of not particularly nice chemicals across the fashion space, from the production of fibers themselves to their dyeing and finishing. The last category would be the end of life of these materials. I think there's a growing acknowledgement of both the technical aspects, things like the productions of microplastics, when a bunch of these synthetics are even just washed, much less disposed of. Also, there's a real striking sort of human cost to things like this in the form of what's often called waste colonialism, where either waste products or even unsold product is shipped off to parts of the world, basically to get it out of the eyes of the Western consumer. What we're trying to do at TomTex is, in the best case, approach all of these things. So we have a very strict mission, which is that we want to make things that are completely petrochemical free. So there's no carbon in our materials that came from below the ground. It's not just that these are recycled materials, they are completely bio-based. That's probably the hardest one. The second is we're going from a waste material, fundamentally. We can talk about sourcing, I think, in a minute, but we really wanted to find interesting molecules that already exist and use them more productively than how they're being used now, and bring those into valorized, more productive circulation. We want to do that with conscientiousness and care across that supply chain. So understanding where our materials come from, understanding how they're made, understanding who's making them is a really important part of this. And that, from a business perspective, is also great because there's a whole bunch of traceability and digital passport requirements, for instance, that are coming down the pipe that this is well suited for. That's not the reason to do it. The reason to do it is because it's the right thing to do, but helps. And then at the end of life, if you're using something that's 100% bio-based, not always, but oftentimes you get biodegradability for free. If it's a natural molecule that something already eats, it'll eat it in whatever form you've transformed it into, generally, not always, but generally. So making sure that our materials are biodegradable is also really important. We also have a pretty high standard here. The goal is home compostable. There's lots of stuff that is technically compostable, but it's only in industrial settings, and the fraction of waste that actually ends up there is very small, particularly in the US. So we want it to be something that you can genuinely chuck out into your garden, and it acts almost like a fertilizer. In some cases, in our case, often very much like a fertilizer because it's a nitrogen-heavy material. But we're trying to approach the whole life cycle perspective. The inputs have to be correct. The production environment and production process has to be correct. The carbon emissions from all that have to be correct. And then what happens to it at the end of its life needs to fit that. And we think that's a great business case. I think the consumer is really tired of being sold a bill of sustainability goods that's not really quite true. The amount of greenwashing in the fashion space is really kind of astronomical. So being able to say, hey, look, not only are we sustainable, but we're the real deal. We're the thing that you think you're buying when you go buy a vegan leather or something like that, we think is a great case to both the designer and the consumer at the end of the day.
That's amazing. It's a great ethos to have, and we welcome that, of course. Let's get into what are TomTex's materials derived from and what is the science behind their production.
So our base component is a molecule called chitosan. Chitosan is a polysaccharide, like cellulose. So fundamentally, it's a polymer made of a chain of sugars. Depending on how you count, it's probably the second most common polysaccharide on the planet after cellulose. So if cellulose is cotton and linen and components of trees, chitin and its derivative chitosan, the distinction there is chemical and somewhat subtle, but chitin is in the exoskeletons of anything that has an exoskeleton. So marine arthropods, shrimp, crabs, lobsters, things like this, but also terrestrial arthropods, insects, arachnids. It's also in the cell walls to one degree or another of all fungi. So it's all over the place in nature, but hasn't really been used so much as a bulk dry material all that much, which is a shame because it has some really interesting properties. The most interesting for us is that you can work with it in solution in a liquid form with really gentle solvent systems, basically just a water-based system. That's the fundamental core idea. You take this polysaccharide that you can get from a number of different sources, and you can dissolve this up into a liquid, and you can transform this liquid into any number of things. What we're starting with is basically a thick film material that you can think of like a leather, almost like a synthetic leather, but you can also make other stuff with it. You can theoretically do things like 3D print with it. You can theoretically make fiber out of it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. We started with leather effectively because the economics work well in this space, but the theoretical underpinning of the technology is quite adaptable to other things. So we are interested in exploring that in the future. This allows you to make interesting high performance materials. It allows a huge amount of aesthetic versatility. So you can control the texture more or less arbitrarily. You control the color more or less arbitrarily. You can basically think of it like a paint. You can just mix in pigments to get different colors. Importantly, you can use existing industrial infrastructure to actually make the final sheets or rolls of fabric. Basically, the same stuff that you use to make a synthetic leather, which is taking a synthetic polymer solution and casting it out into a long roll. You can use that with our stuff with some sort of minimal modifications. So we think our path to scale, therefore price point, is hopefully pretty competitive, especially because we're starting with the inputs that we're started. So we have basically two different sources at the moment that we're focusing on for chitosan. The first is waste shrimp shells. This is an interesting case. It involves a little bit of explanation of how shrimp actually works, but this is a pre-consumer waste stream. So we, for instance, know the Vietnamese market the best, although there are other markets. And the way it works in Vietnam is that there are literally nobody knows, tens of thousands of small farmers in the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam. These folks are often people that once grew rice and now can't because of climate change. The Delta is getting too salty to grow rice. And so they've actually had to switch to things like shrimp and other forms of aquaculture. Thousands and thousands and thousands of different farmers sell to maybe a dozen large processing plants. They will then take these shrimp and they will dehead them and deshell them and freeze them. And that's what you're going to buy in a Western supermarket. That also means that these guys produce an enormous amount of shrimp shells and shrimp heads. If someone like us doesn't do something with them, this is a proper waste stream. This ends up back in the ocean or in a landfill. Occasionally, it's used as a very low value fertilizer, but that also has problems from salt carryover to actually poison fields. This is a material that does damage if you don't do something with it, which is an important distinction from some other waste streams. It's an important distinction from leather, for instance, where the economics of hide production are significantly different from something like this. This is not a side stream. It's properly trash if you don't do something with it. So we can take that and, again, do something more productive with it, find something interesting to do with it. So that's stream one. Stream two is from mushroom. This is a slightly different process to isolate this molecule. It's a slightly different source. These are, generally speaking, at the moment, although we'd love to change this, these are mushrooms that are grown for purpose on wastes rather than being a waste themselves. You take sawdust or something like that and grow oyster mushroom on it, and then you can process this into our material. This produces some other side streams, some protein fractions and things that are generally sold into things like animal feed. But this produces, from our perspective, the same molecule. So the downstream process for us is the same. We just buy these from different suppliers. These are extant supply chains. Chitosan is produced from both of these sources at industrial scales. So we don't have to go build out this from scratch, which is great. This produces basically two different SKUs, one that we call Series WS for waste shrimp, and one that we call Series M. Series WS is a little bit less expensive, but it's not vegan. Series M is a little bit more expensive and is vegan. And so this also allows us to do some differentiation and present different versions of this product to different customers who might have different preferences.
So the mushroom base material is considered vegan, whereas the shrimp one is not.
Yeah, some of this hinges on how strict you are with the definition of vegan. An animal did not die for this, but it is an animal product. So different folks have different opinions and different weights. We wanted to just make sure we could serve a variety of different preferences when it comes to this. We also know that in the fashion space, the vegan label and vegan materials have had an enormous amount of uptake from our perspective, despite the fact that what this really means 99% of the time is just plastic. One of the things we're interested in doing is saying, hey, look, we are vegan, but let's remind you what that actually means. We're vegan the way you think it means, not vegan the way that you're being sold. So that's a story that we want to tell with this type of material. Again, connecting back to that idea that you don't want to trick people into this story. You want to show them a vision of the future that is more open and productive and interesting and honest. That's really the way to convert people to your cause when it comes to sustainability, rather than sneakily playing some game with labeling requirements.
Yes. First of all, I love the Series WS and Series M. It makes it sound very, very luxurious. I do recall when we were at your lab, you had samples of the material and it looked beautiful. I just felt like this is materials from the future. So I can see it being used in luxury products. But I guess I'm really curious to know, do they have different performance characteristics because they're derived from different sources, or are they the same because you process it in a way that ends up becoming similar?
Yeah, when it comes to that base material, the molecule is the molecule to us. So we'll buy it to a certain spec, certainly, but we can get that spec from both sources. So we have some versatility to tune the mechanical performance to different use cases. So really basic stuff, thicker, thinner, things like that, obviously color and texture. But even some of the things like how much it stretches, how it drapes, the stiffness, the hand feel, stuff like that, we can tune that as well. But that's done in the formulation stage. These are not pure chitosan materials. There's other stuff in our base recipe that helps us move those different characteristics around. But when it comes to zero, no modifications, no customization, we don't really care from a technical perspective where it comes from. The input is the same.
That's so cool. I mean, when we talk about your material and some of the other biomaterials being produced from mycelium or from bacteriocellulose, a lot of times we say it's a leather alternative, but they're really not. These are novel biomaterials that have different performance characteristics. What do you say as opposed to alternate leather?
Oh, man. We haven't really settled on a good word for this. I think this is really tough. You're absolutely right. Alternative is not a nice word for this. Again, you want to present a positive, expansive vision of what these things can be. And so there are a few things we can do to highlight that. There's some colors that we can do that are pretty difficult to achieve with a traditional leather. We can theoretically make stuff that's clear or at least translucent, which I think Eco Leather maybe has a product that's like this, but it's not really leather anymore. It's basically a plastic thing that they've laid on top of leather, as far as I understand. Some of that is down to what you present. You have to give people something that they can hook onto. They can get their head around the idea that it's leather-ish. Then you can go tell this aesthetic story that goes beyond that. Language-wise, it's still really tough. It also depends on who you're talking to. Some designers, especially if you're showing something that's really wacky, like the clear stuff, they'll instantly grok that this is different and new. And they can think about it as if like, hey, look, this is a film made of a new thing, and we can kind of make it look like whatever you want it to look like. And then some folks, you have to be like, oh, no, that's a luxury heritage leather-like material. We can make it feel beautiful. We can make it have all those characteristics that you love with leather. And then you can maybe suggest expansive understandings of what that could mean, both from a supply chain perspective and sustainability perspective, but also an aesthetic one. So that is a delicate dance when you're talking about these materials. But I agree. And I think to go back to biofabricate, this is something that I think a lot of people think about is really this is a new class of material. These are new biomaterials, and this allows you to do both storytelling from a business perspective, but also, again, from a mission perspective, being able to communicate a vision of the future that is open in that way. There's an analogy that I think we use a lot, which is actually to the early days of plastics. early plastics begin as mimics. They're fake ivory and tortoiseshell and silk and stuff like that. But the age of plastics, that Monsanto, DuPont, World's Fair Pavilion, Disney kind of vision for the future, is not mimicking anything. The whole point of that is that it's something new and something different and something wonderful and something about the way the world can be with these materials. I think that's the kind of story that we're interested in telling. And fundamentally, it's a story that we don't just need to tell, we need to be able to do. This is slightly off topic, but I think connected enough. Humans make materials basically by taking complicated molecules, usually ones derived from oil, and cramming energy into them into the form that you want them to be. A piece of aluminum is almost better conceptualized as a battery. Like all this energy you've had to pour into this thing to get it to do that. Balsa wood is twice the specific strength of aluminum, and it's made of sugar and light. And that's because nature is really, really good at taking these kind of boring molecules and architecting them, doing nanotechnology basically, to produce really, really remarkable mechanical properties. That's what you want to learn how to do. That's the long-term idea of us, and I think of a lot of other people, is that you're not just learning how to make leather. You're learning, why is leather interesting? What about its architecture allows it to do what it does? And then you can take those learnings and translate them back into making more and more and more of the world in this way that's low carbon intensity, low energy intensity, using materials that already exist on the planet, but using those to make remarkable, productive, high-performance materials, again, that are not alternatives to things, but a new way of rebuilding the quote-unquote bioeconomy. It's not just about substituting your fundamental carbon source. It actually has to touch the way things are physically made. That connection to reality, connection to lived reality, connection to people's tactile experience, I think is, again, part of this connection to fashion and part of the story that we really have to learn how to tell if you're thinking about the post-climate crisis future.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Yeah, it's something new. I think depending on where it's going, or talking about fashion, but these words are invented. Like leather was a word that was invented by somebody, right? There's
Sure.
spandex, there's Gore-Tex, there's a lot of the X, latex.
Yeah, lots of that one. Yeah, lots of X.
We'll have to come up with a new word, I guess, depending on where the materials are going. What part of the fashion industry are they being used? Are they being used in the athletic world? Are they being used on the runway? Are they being used in bags or something? So that could help create that word. But I just think it's really fascinating, the idea of creating this new word to describe a material that has never been created before.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but I think we'll probably end up settling on something that is hopefully pretty descriptive. Wishing for the day when that's something I don't have to explain. I think a lot of people already intuitively understand it. I think they don't quite have the language to describe what they're actually looking for. And that latent demand is really, I think, from a business perspective, what we're trying to serve.
Yeah, you talked about your sourcing, both the mushrooms and the shrimp shells are readily available. But how does that fit into the TomTex circular manufacturing process? You talked about beginning of life, end of life. Give us a picture of what that looks like.
This is a real fundamental thing for us. The waste fraction of these materials needs to be as absolutely high as you can. This is the point, taking things that are considered useless and revealing their true use. It starts there. Within the manufacturing process itself, we're trying to be as low impact as we can, right? So this means using water as a solvent as much as you can, green chemistry as much as you can, really being pretty hard-nosed about a bunch of this stuff. To some extent, that comes with the territory because these are natural biopolymers. They want to be wet. They like water. There's certain things that naturally fit together in that way. Most obvious end of life, again, the biodegradability closes that loop. If you're taking it from the normal carbon cycle, you can put it back in the normal carbon cycle. There are elements within that we are interested in developing more technically. There are theoretically, for instance, ways you can do lossless pattern, where you can take our material and recycle it back into the liquid form and then make new stuff out of it. This is super interesting, particularly when it comes to leather. because loss fractions for leather, particularly mid-grade leathers, can be as high as 50%. Like half of what you buy in terms of sheet goes out as powder or scrap because the animal had a bug bite or ran into a fence or something. And so there's a mark, and so you can't use that portion. And even just the sort of Tetris game of laying out stuff onto this very uneven shape that is a hide necessitates a certain amount of waste. This is tricky to actually go implement because your hands have to be really into the nitty-gritty of somebody's factory. And the way global supply chains work in fashion makes that challenging. Brands don't often make things. They design things, and someone else is bidding for the pleasure of making them. So there's a bit of a dance you have to do to incorporate this. But we have a couple of early conversations about elements like this where we really want to be integrated with people and say, hey, look, you're starting from waste. You're basically lossless, you're basically wasteless in the process. And then at the end of the day, you can take this stuff and bury it and it'll just go. That, again, is a much more harmonious vision of the production cycle than the way it functions now, which is basically you extract a whole bunch of energy out of the ground. Some of these factories are hellish is maybe too strong, but they're aggressively industrial to transform them into these materials that you want. And then at the end of the day, they get chopped up into bits and end up in your liver? I don't know. The contrast here is fairly striking. So this has been embedded in the philosophy and in the technology of the company from day one. And that's certainly made my job harder. But if it's worth doing, it's worth doing correctly. Another way of phrasing that cultural versus economic distinction is that I'm a little skeptical that we'll optimize our way out of this. Just iteratively improving, iteratively shaving a few percent is one way you could approach this. I'm a little skeptical of it. I think you have to break hard for the hard thing and then work backwards from there. That seems to be a way to maybe make change a little bit quicker than 2% a year over the next couple of decades to get to 100% bio-based or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the crazy stat that stood out for me from Biofabricate was that despite all the use of leather, something like 130 million hides go straight to landfill. We grow that many more cows and we don't even use their hides. What is wrong?
Yeah, the matched production supply demand stuff here is really gnarly. Even with clothes, there's overproduction of stuff because people got a demand number wrong. And then you have a whole bunch of bags that get slashed and burned or something. I think people are slowly understanding how much of a problem that is. But a 1,000-foot vision of that and trying to architect what is fundamentally for us a fairly verticalized company. We go from fairly low on the value chain to something that's really quite finished. It goes right to the guy that's making the handbag. That stack, I think, can hopefully smooth and optimize away. This is the place where optimizing maybe is a good thing. Some of those cycles where just at every step you're losing 10% of something and it just ends up in a landfill. That type of stuff I think really has to get tightened up. And I think it is slowly getting tightened up for these cycles to become actually self-sustaining. Again, as opposed to just like 80% self-sustaining and the 20% is as damaging as the status quo is or something. There's plenty of cases where you can corner yourself in quite nasty ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested in this idea of the material being biodegradable. And this is something that I would like to understand is how do you prevent the material from biodegrading on your body? I know there's probably biocoating, maybe something like a coating to help prevent that, but then does that affect the biodegradability? And have you done any tests to understand how long it takes to biodegrade? So can you kind of shed some light there?
Yeah, sure. I think the best version here is by analogy. So a wooden table is a biodegradable object. That will vanish pretty quickly if you chuck it in the right environment. But in your house, it's fine. That's the line you're walking. It's something that can be eaten, but that the stuff on your body doesn't eat. That's kind of where you want to be. This is to some extent tunable. You can change a variety of things in the formulation to make it more or less susceptible to this. And you probably will do that. If you say biodegradability to a car guy, for instance, someone in automotive, they flip out. They really don't like that. So you would want to be on the longer end of that spectrum for someone like that. And for someone that's making a mid-market handbag or something, you'd probably dial it down. So there's a bunch of customization that you can do given our process that allows you to do this.
So the microbes on the body would not eat any part of the material.
Every microbe on every body? I don't know. But biology is this big smeared out thing. I'm sure you can find somebody whose body that'll munch on it is fine. But The goal is something like your hair or a wood table or even a leather handbag, a less finished leather handbag sits in the same space as something that is within the context of an object that a human uses every day and cares a little bit about. It's just fine. It will last for many years. And outside of that context, where the microbial load is a little bit higher and the right folks are around, it'll get degraded quickly. The way you prove this is a variety of different things. Oh man, certifications are complicated. The one that we'll end up going for is a specific home compostable rating. There's really only a couple of certs that do this. The majority of compostable stuff in the US is a certification that is actually not home compatible. A lot of people think it is, it's not. So you do have to be very careful with this. And you really test two different endpoints. The first is the functional category of home compostable. Are these conditions sufficient to degrade this? And the second is, what is the ultimate destination for all this carbon? Because what you don't want to do is make a material that mechanically falls apart, but then ends up as microplastics or ends up as a dead end compound that's a forever chemical, which can happen. There's some things that look like they biodegrade, and they biodegrade all the way down to molecular chains, but then they stop there. And they're sort of dead-ended and don't return to the carbon cycle. So there's a series of tests that you do that actually measure the CO2 produced effectively when you degrade your material in a natural environment. And that proves that it's running all the way through the cycle and getting metabolized, getting eaten by something, and really truly returning to the carbon cycle. Those are very expensive and take like 8 months. So we'll run those once we have a more full lock on the recipe. But this is something that is a hard requirement for us. It isn't like we're going to run this and just say like, oh, we got too close. We're iterating towards that and know that we need to hit those marks. So I can't give you a cert number in a third-party PDF. But again, it's a really core part of what we're doing. And if you're not going to do it well, there's no point in doing it. So we're serious about both of those as metrics that we think are core to the mission of the company as well as core to the business proposition. Being able to go to a consumer and saying like, look, this is what we tested. This is why we tested. This is how this is different from other materials. And you're better off for buying it. And you're better off for knowing about it after that too. That type of education is also pretty important.
You'll want to be able to say that it could biodegrade in 4 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, the typical time for home is 90 days, but there's different cutoffs. And so you can say 90, 120. You also might say a different number depending on if it's terrestrial versus marine. And even if it's saltwater versus freshwater, there'll be different numbers. These tests, generally, you will test until it happens. And then you're comparing it to, is it faster or slower than a micronized cellulose or something that's sort of generally very biodegradable. So on the back end, that's how these things work. On the front end, it just needs to be something that the consumer can trust but verify. It has the stamp, and then you can actually go chuck it in your little rotating bin out the back, and it does turn into worm food in a believable, comprehensible, usable timeline.
Yeah, we were just told that the gold standard today for compostability is the Austrian TUV certification or something like that.
AUS TUV home. As far as I can tell, there's them and there's a German DIN cert that are the only ones that are stamps. You get a logo that are specific to home compostability. And they'll use an Australian test, a French test, or a EU-wide test that's kind of weird to verify and then distribute those like certifications. There's an Austrian company that provides the stamp, but they use an Australian. I think this is true. It's very complicated. And it's very confusing to the consumer as well. The amount of different certs out there that say a variety of some useful and some, frankly, not very useful things is part of the reason why greenwashing is a trick here, is because you can play enough games to cobble together stuff that sounds quite convincing, even if it's not. So this is a challenge that I hope as people understand more about how these things work, they'll become a little bit more fluent in, and hopefully we can help with that as well.
Right. Well, we know the fashion industry gets criticized for the amount of material it produces, the amount of waste that it produces, but also for exploiting workers and harming communities, especially in the global South. How is it that TomTex ensures fair employment practices and ecological care throughout its supply chain?
Yeah. So back to certifications, there's a few of these things that you'll end up going for. Some of the better certs, things like Blue Sign is one of them. There's a couple of other ones. Incorporate basically social practices into these things. So people go audit your factories, people go audit your production. The really, really good stuff that we're going to chase, again, once recipes a little bit more locked, will hopefully speak to the fact that we've done our homework when it comes to this. What that actually looks like in practice is we went and visited farms in Vietnam. We went and visited the factory that makes the chitosan from that stuff. We really want to have visibility top to bottom into this chain to make sure that someone's not pulling our leg when it comes to some of the stuff that's being said. That's pretty important. We know that fashion is maybe not the worst in the world, but it's giving people a run for their money in terms of exploitative practices. There might be a point in saving the planet, but there's not much point in saving people on the planet by way of harming other people. If part of the point of this mission is to minimize the harm that we're causing, not just make number go down, you have to pay attention to this. This has to be core to the mission. And we do take that pretty seriously. So understanding how these farmers have been affected by this change in salinity in the Delta was really, really interesting to learn and really, really interesting to understand that hopefully what we're doing is contributing to supporting a group of people in a, frankly, national food supply chain that is otherwise genuinely pretty imperiled by these changing conditions. And hopefully the use of waste in particular is a great way to transmit value to people who are generally being extracted from as opposed to being compensated for. That sort of ethic, I think, fits quite well into a cradle-to-cradle design ethic. Those principles are quite easy to extend to those that consider people not just objects. That, again, is something that is quite easy to forget because the power of a globalized supply chain is in many ways to make these things invisible. That's part of the function of this, is to smooth out the wrinkles that people might otherwise notice. Fashion in particular, because it's so fragmented and so globalized, is invisible in exactly that way many times. And so being, again, quite forceful in the approach, not just from a policy perspective, but from a fundamentals of the technology perspective, I think is a good way to marry that desire and that mission and really that requirement for building a sustainable future that is not just sustainable in terms of carbon in the atmosphere, but sustainable in a harmonious and livable way for as many people on the planet as possible.
Well said. Very well said. So I'm curious, right now you're talking about Series WS for the waste shrimp, and then we have the Series M for the mushroom. But of course, you're probably tinkering in the lab before you guys landed on these materials. What were some other waste sources that you played around with, and why didn't they make the cut?
Yeah, the crustacean stuff is the most developed chain. Shrimp is probably the largest of that, but we've played with some other stuff, some crab shell stuff, for instance. There's shrimp from different regions. There's differences in, particularly speaking of human costs of these things, right? There's different regions that do shrimp farming differently in ways that can be quite exploitative. So we were quite careful with that. Some of this is not the exact focus of the company at the moment. We really do want to rely on existing supply chains as much as we can. You want to build one business, not several stacked on top of each other in a trench coat. So finding folks that can already supply at the volumes and prices that we need is a reasonable place to start. From that perspective, the place where we've spent the most time thinking is actually on the mushroom side. So right now, as I mentioned before, these mushrooms are usually grown for purpose. They're going to be grown on ag wastes, but it would be nice to have proper mushroom waste. And there's really two different ways you can do this. The first is to find people that are growing mushrooms for human consumption and take scrap. That supply is relatively large, but not that big. The second is to find someone that is producing industrial quantities of fungal material. This could be, for instance, from all the new food people that are using fungi as part of their meat alternatives, but even legacy industry, citric acid, the sour stuff on the outside of your sour candies, that crystal, that's produced industrially from a fermentative process, from a filamentous fungus. I'm having a slow series of conversations with the Cargill-esque people of the world to try to be like, hey, look, I know you produce trucks of this stuff, and I have a guy that will buy trucks of this stuff. Can we please just get everyone on the phone together and play matchy-matchy? Because a lot of times it's just that people haven't bothered to connect them. These streams exist, and the use cases for them exist, and they just don't. There's a bunch of really interesting development work to be done here to close loops that are technically proven and economically proven, and you just need to get people to talk to each other. That in particular is an area that we spent a little bit of time focusing on. It's not core to the business, but we think is a really great way to expand the use of this really interesting molecule per se, as well as expand our supply chain and stabilize our supply chain as well.
Can you let us know to date, where have the materials been used? I seem to remember reading an article or seeing some pictures, but give our listeners a view of where they can see these materials in action.
Yeah, we've had stuff in the last 3 fashion weeks. So New York with Peter Doe, Paris with a brand called Matre Pierre, London with a brand called De Pezza, New York again with a brand called Dauphinette, and then we'll have some stuff with Dauphinette again this coming season. this functions for us 3 things. First, it's fun. Being able to actually go produce materials and get to go to a show and get to actually make an object is really great. 2, it can build awareness of the brand and kind of FOMO. It's really nice to work with oftentimes smaller designers who are maybe a little bit more nimble, and that oftentimes larger fashion brands will look to actually for inspiration. That's a great way to get your name out there and to get people interested in the material. And 3, it proves that it's real. I think it's quite easy to take a picture of a sheet of something and say that you're making the next great thing. It's different to make a pair of pants. You learn a lot about how a seamstress actually handles things and the way it sews and cuts and all this other stuff. It's very difficult to capture in a spec sheet. So that iterative process and making sure you can actually make object with them is pretty important to this. I think we've been fairly successful at getting this stuff, at least on the runway. All of this stuff is only done for the runway, or for a few things have ended up with celebrities and things like that. So these are very, very small runs of these, which is a necessity just because me and my team are physically making this material at the moment. So it's sort of not the best use of our time to go make 1,000 sheets of something that's probably not going to make anybody's pocketbook happy. But we really think mid this year is when we're going to transition into more proper commercial stuff. And that'll be the first time that you can actually go out and buy a bag or a wallet or maybe even a jacket made out of this stuff. That's our timeline internally.
Is that what was made on the runway? Were they dresses or bags, or can you paint a picture of that?
We've done a pair of pants. We've done a top. We've done a part of a top. We've done another funky dress. Well, we're about to do a handbag, and then we're about to do some shoes. So we've done, I think, fairly well across the apparel spectrum. That's a variety of different techniques, a variety of different styles. None of it looks like leather. We've made stuff that looks like other fabrics. We've made stuff that's translucent. You can really make into whatever you want it to look like, and helps communicate that expansive story, that vision of the future that we're interested in telling. So we really haven't made a plain Jane just bag. It's always been stuff that is a little bit different. And I think that's been very fun to be able to talk to designers and come up with ideas. That's great. And it's been, I think, effective from a positioning and branding perspective as well.
When I saw the samples when we went to your lab, I was like, this is very high-end, futuristic space material. Like if people go into, I don't know, space station, or when we eventually terraform Mars, and the translucent deep green color, very organic. It's like, wow, this is like nothing I've seen before, but I could see that it could be used. It just completely changes the way you look at material. And you're like, is this something you wear, or like a home good, or maybe it's like something on top of your table or a curtain? I mean, it was very interesting to see that had this translucent property with a beautiful color.
I don't think we want to restrict ourselves to just the fashion space. I think we've had some conversations with some folks in interiors and hospitality and things like that. And we've also had some conversations with folks in automotive. That's a much longer time scale talking about cars. But there are very, very large markets for this stuff outside of it. And again, if you want to have the most impact, it can't just be something that shows up in just luxury handbags. That's not impact. That's a luxury good. So we really think that because of our process, our goal is price parity with mid-grade leathers, and to be able to go to a designer and say, hey, look, you get all this aesthetic versatility and all this sustainability, and you really don't have to pay much more for it. We really think that's the butter zone for the market. You can't compete with cheap vinyl because it's basically free. And you probably can't compete with white crocodile because at some point, the fact that it was once crocodile is part of the thing. But there's this huge space in the middle for mid-low grade leathers and nicer synthetics that for the synthetics, people think is sustainable, and it's actually just a plastic. And for the other leathers, there's still a very high carbon textile. So people do want to switch out from that, and particularly often want to switch to a vegan version. That butter zone, if you can hit that price point, and we think we can, we really think that's where a lot of the impact lies. You want to be able to do regular leather, and then you want to be able to say, hey, look, you're a mid-grade company, and we can make something that no one has ever seen before, and be able to sort of seamlessly transition between those things, and then go be able to do that for somebody that's making a couch. I don't know, maybe not a couch. The transparent couch might be a bit weird, but you know what I mean.
Depends on what's on the inside.
I guess that's true. You could do a space frame Renzo piano couch or something. I don't know. That could actually be pretty interesting. And similar with automotive. There's an order of operations that you go here. You might start with stuff that's not really high contact surfaces. Car seats are brutal. It's shocking that anything survives a minivan environment. That's kind of nuts. But there's a whole bunch of soft paneling and these and other applications that I think we're well suited to being able to fit into.
Yeah. So your lab is based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and there's a bunch of different buildings there. But there's one building, there's a company that makes spacesuits that's based in the Navy Yard. You guys got to connect. You guys have to connect.
There's some guys that do electric motorcycles and stuff too that we've had some conversations with. Navy Yard's a cool place. There's some other guys that are part of New Lab, which is the space that I'm sitting in right now, that are micromobility of one degree or another. And certainly easy culture fit when it comes to saying this is a sustainable product. This is about the way we should be moving in the future. I think that's a really great synergy for how we think about these problems.
Yeah, very cool.
You and I had a great conversation just about the future of materials and what is possible. We talked a little bit about that here, but how do you imagine biomaterials playing out in the next 10 years?
10 years?
Is that not enough time?
Depends. I think a lot of this is, to some extent, it's a little bit tricky. It depends on how the regulatory environment moves. This is a very boring answer, but we really need to get to a place where the true cost of carbon is actually priced into everyday materials. There's a lot of really remarkable stuff that we can do in the fashion landscape and other durable goods landscapes, again, interiors, that is really enabled by the fact that we understand more and more about how to use these types of molecules productively, responsibly. There are some applications where the economics are just really tough. Packaging, single-use plastics, that's tough because genuinely this stuff is free. The machine time is far more expensive than the cost of the material itself in many cases. So until you're actually pricing in the fact that those materials are using the atmosphere as a sewer, like fundamentally, that's a hard ask. I think consumer sentiment and regulatory pressure are both moving in the right direction. The question is, are we doing it fast enough? The answer to that is almost always going to be no. That's just the default. The answer is no, you're not moving fast enough. So I'm encouraged to see, for instance, a bunch of the stuff that's coming in the EU when it comes to some of the sustainability stuff, when it comes to fashion in particular. Things about traceability, things about not being able to lie quite as much on your label about sustainability claims, really being quite forceful with that. In some cases, forceful enough that the brands are freaking out because they know they can't actually meet the requirement that's coming and they're going to have to really change some stuff. That type of pressure, I think, is pretty important. I'm hopeful that the US, frankly, catches up to the EU in some cases when it comes to this type of environment. I think that there is certainly amongst younger folks a growing and profound understanding of the need to do that. And so I am cautiously hopeful that's going to happen. When it comes to the basics of the science, you can look to nature. There's nearly no, let's say, productive mechanical characteristic that doesn't exist in nature that we use every day. It's not like nature can't make soft materials, hard materials, rigid materials, waterproof material. It's not like we're really lacking this type of functionality in the pool of materials that we see, even just among living things, much less the stuff we could make from the stuff that living things make. The opportunity is clearly there and the functionality is clearly there. So just understanding how to do that, competitively, understanding how to do that responsibly, I think slowly you'll see that push into more and more and more of the material reality that we encounter. The longer timeline, I think, may be easier to imagine for obvious reasons. But my dream, I guess, is really a world where you don't ever have to make a trade. You make a A320 airplane out of 100% bio-based materials. You can do everything you need to do out of these materials that are fundamentally circular and fundamentally renewable. If a seagull can be a seagull, then we can make an airplane out of this stuff too. That's probably stretching when it comes to, the interiors of the jet or something. But for the vast majority of things that we encounter in everyday life, and many of even the high performance materials, I really do think that this must be the way of the future. As much as we can now, applying pressure to the regulatory environment, applying education to help people understand what this means and understand how it impacts them and understand how they can contribute, and then applying knowledge to the problem set. Learning as much as we can about, frankly, the very simple, almost brutish stuff that we're doing now from the perspective of where we need to be, but learning how we can translate that into, you go stare at a friggin' oyster shell for about 20 minutes. These things are just wondrous. They're remarkable. They're beautiful. Learning how to do that, I think, is the dream of the nerd in me. And I think that's the vector is there. The speed probably needs to pick up, but just that alone, I think, is hopeful.
Yeah, that's so great. Very well said. If you're looking for a company that's making material out of seashells, our friends at Biomason, our friends at Prometheus Materials, they're there doing the work.
Speaking of Biofabricate, the very first Biofabricate I attended was, I guess, in 2016, probably. It was at Parsons. And I attended as an usher because you got a free ticket. And I think I still have the t-shirt. You let one person in the door and then you go stand in the corner of the auditorium and listen to the talks. And I remember Ecovators was there, Biomason was there, Spiver was there. There's a bunch of people that are still around that I think we really look up to in terms of what they've been able to build and what they've been able to do. I talked to one of the founders of Biomason the other day, Ginger. I think I really love and respect how a bunch of these companies got their start as design-focused companies. They're the products of designers in many cases, as are we. Our CEO, Ian, is a fashion designer by training. And I do think that helps offset some of the engineer brain optimization stuff that's it's a great forcing function for doing the hard thing and doing the right thing and thinking more about the way these products and this approach works within a larger sustainability system rather than just like, here's my widget that is 10% better. I think that's a very powerful, motivating, and organizational force when it comes to that. And I really respect a lot of the folks that have paved the way when it comes to these ideas and these companies.
And now you're doing it, right?
Amazing.
Now you're the one who's going to be headlining
Attempting.
Biofabricating. Yeah. You're in your lab, stirring the pot right now, making the small batch materials, craft, Brooklyn-based materials.
Materials.
Craft, artisanal materials.
It is a lot like cooking. It's a bit of a heuristic. If it's not something that is simple enough to do in an industrial kitchen, a startup is probably going to have a hard time making a couple million square feet of it without a whole bunch of millions of dollars of money. It's a productive way to think about it, actually, in an interesting way.
Yeah. And so we're excited to see you guys scale up. You're talking about doing that this year. So we'll have to check in with you later this year. I mean, we'll probably check in with you sooner than that because we're neighbors.
Sure.
But on the pod, on the record, we'll definitely have you back on and see how scale up's going.
Yeah, we'd love to.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you so much for coming on the pod and have a good day. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Thank y'all. This is a lot of fun.
Have a great one.
Y'all too.
Erum, what do you think of that conversation?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, Ross, when I met him at an event that they hosted over the holidays, Ross and I talked for quite some time. He's a very good conversationalist. We talked about all sorts of things from science to culture to business. So I'm sure everyone has gotten that perspective. After we recorded the episode, we continued the conversation because we were just talking about like, what is the solution to have big companies that are producing so much product? How do we have them think about sustainability and think about their supply chains? But it all comes down to putting a price on carbon. And that's really the solution that we're just talking about. But there's still really no incentive or enforcement of any regulations that are moving the needle on putting this price on carbon or the sustainable development goals, which came from the UN, that they're trying to share these frameworks with governments and businesses. But those big businesses, they're trying to make some moves, but they're not making those big decisions where they're incorporating more sustainable sourcing of resources. There's that, but there's also the ESGs, which is the environmental, societal, and governance framework that also came out of the UN to be a reporting mechanism for companies and governments on how they address those three pillars. And the UN actually wrote an article saying that the ESGs has been a failure. That is something that we're going to talk about with Tara Shervani in the next week's episode about climate finance. Ross and I, you were part of this conversation for a bit, but then you had to jump off. It's a bit of a doom and gloom, but I think in the end, it's just always a matter of time. You know,
Right.
Time is money, and we don't have much of it when we're talking about climate because there's irreversible damage that's happening. I think that's the urgency and the situation we're in.
What's kind of crazy is you have had significant political pushback against ESG and ESG investing, even though I think it's been shown that investing in ESG related initiatives actually is beneficial and grows the economy faster than sticking to kind of legacy ways of doing business. I'd love to see the reports that show that, but that's my understanding. I think we should have someone come on and talk to us about it as well. You have had a lot of political pushback against it. And yet in the United States, the states that are the most focused on ESG are the ones that seem to be economically the most successful. I know the big pushback has been in Texas, and Texas is the second largest economy in the United States. But Texas has disproportionately benefited from solar and wind power, even though they've been pushing this anti-ESG legislation. So it's very interesting.
I would just say, though, the investments are going towards these ESG focused companies versus those that are not. But those are the early stages. When we're talking about the legacy companies or the companies that dominate our commerce, it's going to be them that have to make the investments in themselves, because they're not going to do anything that's going to require time, which is money, and change their money train, change the flow of money. If there's any pause, that's something that's not motivating. So what are those incentives besides just making sure our climate is in good condition and it's balanced? We have balanced climate and we're healthy. I mean, that unfortunately isn't motivation enough for these companies because they're doing it. We have younger generations that are, I mean, I hate to say it that way, but that does seem to be the trend, that are more interested in sustainable products, animal-free, vegan products, safer products. The younger generations that are more knowledgeable in where products come from and how these companies are getting the resources. A lot of that sometimes is assuaged through like greenwashing and marketing. So there's some of that smoke and mirrors. But let me just, let's put a pin on it, because I think our conversation with Tara Shervani, which will be released next week, we go into a bit more of this. And it's on the flip side of the doom and gloom and things more optimistic. So she talks about solutions.
Yeah, I think it's always worth saying that as humans, our brains tend to focus on the negative. That just is the way we're wired. But there is a lot of really great stuff happening. We are making that happen. We are part of the change. We'll have the conversation with Tara next week, which you should listen in on. There is a lot going on. I just thought we would remind our listeners, if you're going to SymBio Beta, you're thinking about going to SymBio Beta, please do use the Grow Everything code. As you register, you can save $300. It's a significant amount to save for that ticket. Was there anything else, Erum, before we close this episode out?
No, we have so many great episodes coming up. We have quite the lineup of guests that are already booked for the next couple months. So stay tuned for that. Talking to people doing all sorts of amazing things when it comes to ingredients, materials. And we're going to have someone come on and talk about space. So you won't want to miss that. Tune in weekly. And please write us a review, Apple, Spotify. That really helps us. And any thoughts or comments, the phone number and contact info is in the show notes. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.